grand concert hall was empty, its silence broken only by the sharp voice of conductor Richard Wellington. "Get him off the stage. He'll destroy the Bösendorfer." His words cut through the air like a verdict. Standing beneath a lone spotlight was Thomas Miller, 68 years old, a Vietnam veteran. His posture was upright, steady, the kind of stance only years of discipline could shape. In one hand he held a white cane, and with the other, his fingertips brushed gently across the polished concert piano. A few nervous chuckles echoed from the technicians and musicians nearby. To them, the idea of an elderly man, without sight, daring to sit at one of the world's most prestigious instruments, felt absurd. Wellington sneered. "This is a $290,000 Imperial Bösendorfer. It's not for amateurs." Thomas didn't flinch. He simply turned toward the voice, his clouded eyes fixed somewhere far away. With quiet determination, he lowered himself onto the bench. From the front row, Festival Director James Harrington shifted uneasily. The festival's selection process was legendary. Out of 1,200 applicants that year, only 14 had made the cut. None of them were older men with no credentials, let alone someone without sight. How Thomas had found his way to this stage was a mystery, and a risk Harrington wasn't willing to challenge in front of Wellington's powerful sponsors. "You have 2 minutes," Wellington snapped. "Not a second more." Thomas inclined his head slightly. "Then 2 minutes is all I'll need." His voice was calm, carrying the faint warmth of the South. Just 3 weeks earlier, Thomas had been in his modest Nashville apartment, seated at an old upright piano his late wife, Clara, had bought years ago at a military auction. Scarred by cigarette burns and coffee stains, it was priceless to him. It was the piano that had kept him alive after the war, after the ambush in 1971 had taken his sight, his friends, and the life he once knew. During his long recovery, Clara, who had been his nurse, had urged him to try music therapy. "Music is mathematics for the soul," she used to say. And so Thomas taught himself, guided not by scores or teachers, but by touch, intuition, and a sensitivity no conservatory could replicate. For decades, he played only for Clara. When she passed away 8 months ago, the silence in his home became unbearable. He began playing in small venues, veterans' halls, charity events, neighborhood cafes. It was at one of those humble performances that Sarah Lindsay, a young doctoral student, first heard him. Struck by his sound, she secretly recorded his performance and sent it to the festival organizers. Against all odds, Thomas Miller was given a chance, and now here he was. The room grew still. Thomas had asked for no braille sheet, no suggested piece. He simply rested his hands on the keys. The same hands that once carried a rifle now trembled, not with fear, but with anticipation. Then he began to play. The music rose softly at first, like a whisper of dawn in the jungle. You could almost hear the call of distant birds, the rustle of leaves, the steady breath of soldiers waiting in silence. Each note carried weight, not of theory, but of memory. The audience, expecting failure, slowly leaned forward. Wellington's arms dropped from their defiant cross, his face shifting from disdain to disbelief. Thomas wasn't just playing a song. He was telling a story, his story. A life of battles, of loss, of love, and of resilience poured into sound. Backstage, Sarah smiled knowingly. The hall had come expecting to witness a mistake. Instead, they were witnessing something unforgettable. She carried a secret no one else in that hall knew. Thomas Miller was not simply an old man at a piano. What looked like a moment of humiliation would soon become the spark for one of the most remarkable stories of musical redemption the world had ever seen. And if those first notes already stirred something in your heart, stay with us, because what Thomas was about to do would silence his critics and prove that true talent has no limits. The last tones of his piece lingered in the vast, empty auditorium. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Even Wellington, who had granted him only 2 minutes, found himself frozen in disbelief. "That's enough," he finally muttered, his voice less certain than before. "2 minutes are over. Thank you for the demonstration. But this festival has standards." Thomas rose calmly, gathering his cane with quiet dignity. "Thank you for the opportunity, sir," he replied. Backstage, Sarah Lindsay was waiting. At 27, sharp-eyed and determined, she represented a new generation unafraid to challenge the old rules of classical music. "You were incredible," she whispered as she guided him away. "I've never seen Wellington look so shaken." Thomas only smiled faintly. "I'm not here to impress people like him." On the drive back to the hotel, silence filled the car. Sarah finally broke it. "How did you learn to play like that?" "I've never heard anything like what you did today." Thomas turned his face toward the window. "You know the saying, seeing through the darkness? For me, it's not just a metaphor." 2 days later, Sarah arrived at his small rented apartment, carrying a folder and her laptop. "Good news and bad news," she announced. "Bad news. Wellington convinced the committee to cut you from the official program. Good news. I found something better." From the kitchenette came Thomas's calm reply. "Don't worry about me, Sarah. I've lived long enough to know that closed doors aren't the end of the road." "It's not just about worry," Sarah insisted. "It's about justice, and maybe a little revenge too." Her plan was daring. She had secured the historic St. Matthew's Church just 2 blocks from the main concert hall for Thomas to perform at the exact same time as Wellington's grand recital. With help from friends in the cultural media department, she would broadcast it live online. Thomas poured the tea without spilling a drop. "You're brilliant and stubborn. You remind me of my Clara." Sarah leaned in. "You never told me how Clara came into your life." His hand brushed the scar along his temple. "She taught me how to see again, in ways no one else could have imagined." In the following weeks, Wellington made his contempt louder. On a podcast, he dismissed Thomas as a charity case posing as a musician. At an open rehearsal, when a journalist asked about the veteran pianist, Wellington laughed. "Perhaps we should add a new category for inspirational amateurs, right next to the children's program." What he didn't realize was that every insult only fueled curiosity and built anticipation for Thomas's rival performance. The night before, Thomas and Sarah rehearsed in the empty church. His hands shaped sounds that filled the wooden beams with resonance. "Are you sure you want to play this tomorrow?" Sarah asked softly. "People expect Chopin, Beethoven." Thomas paused, his fingers hovering over the keys. "When you lose your sight in battle, Sarah, you discover there are 2 kinds of darkness, one that imprisons you and one that sets you free. My music comes from the second kind." Meanwhile, across town, Wellington sat in his luxury apartment, irritated that the newspapers were calling the event the Duel of 2 Pianists. His assistant entered hesitantly with a tablet. "Sir, you should see this. Online reservations for your rival's concert are nearly full." "Ridiculous," Wellington snapped, tossing the tablet aside. Who would choose an old church over the finest auditorium in the city? But reality was catching up with him. On the morning of the performance, Thomas awoke before dawn. From his suitcase, he carefully took out a worn wooden box, his most treasured secret. Sarah found him already dressed, clutching the wooden box. "What's that?" she asked. "Something I've kept for nearly 50 years, Thomas replied. "And today is the day it's finally revealed." By late afternoon, the church was already overflowing. 2 hours before the recital, journalists, bloggers, and students crammed into the pews, setting up cameras for the live broadcast. In the small dressing room, Sarah noticed a change in him, not fear, but a deeper unease. Thomas slowly opened the box. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly. Inside lay a yellowed newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Musical prodigy leaves Juilliard to serve his country. My nation needs me more than music," says Miller. Sarah's hands trembled as she read. My God, Thomas, you studied at Juilliard. For 3 years, he confirmed with a wistful smile, under the same man who now insists I don't belong on his stage. The revelation struck Sarah like lightning. Wellington? He was your teacher? He never really looked at me. Thomas answered softly, pulling out a faded photograph. A young man in uniform shaking hands with a youthful Richard Wellington. Tonight isn't about revenge, Sarah. It's about redemption, his and mine. At 7:30 p.m., the contrast between the two venues could not have been sharper. In the prestigious Symphony Hall, Richard Wellington stepped onto the stage to polite but scattered applause, the hall only half full. Across town, in the humble wooden interior of St. Matthew's Church, people pressed shoulder to shoulder, the air buzzing with anticipation. Cameras were positioned for the live stream, already trending online. Adjusting his tuxedo, Wellington declared to the audience, "Tonight, I will perform Rachmaninoff with the precision and respect true classical music deserves." His words carried a thinly veiled jab at the veteran, whose rival performance had stolen part of his spotlight. Meanwhile, Thomas was gently guided to the modest Yamaha upright waiting at the front of the church. No imperial Bosendorfer, no grandeur, just an old, restored piano donated years ago. "There are important people out there," Sarah whispered nervously. "Critics, bloggers, even conservatory teachers." Thomas smiled. "I'm not here for them." Sarah stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced, "tonight you will hear something no school can teach." The crowd fell into reverent silence. Thomas sat, no sheet music in sight, his hands poised above the keys. The first notes emerged, not performance, but confession. His composition began in the disciplined academic style of Juilliard in the 1960s. Any trained ear could hear it immediately. In the audience, an older critic whispered, frowning, That sounds like Wellington in his early years." Back at Symphony Hall, Wellington was midway through his program when his assistant slipped to his side. "Sir, there's a problem. The veteran's recital is going viral, and they've uncovered a photo." "What photo?" Wellington snapped, his fingers tightening on the keys. The assistant hesitated, then showed him the tablet. The image of a young soldier shaking hands with Wellington decades ago, now circling the internet. The caption, "Blind veteran revealed as Wellington's forgotten Juilliard student." Wellington's blood ran cold. Tommy Miller, my God. At that very moment, Thomas's playing soared into a brilliant passage. Technical mastery intertwined with raw, lived emotion. It was Juilliard precision, transformed by years of struggle, loss, and resilience. The church sat spellbound. Sarah wept silently backstage. Then Thomas paused. His voice carried through the wooden rafters. "This part is for my teacher, Richard Wellington. He taught me that perfection is the highest goal of music. But life has taught me something greater, that truth is what gives music its soul." The live stream count surged past 50,000 viewers. Symphony Hall emptied seat by seat as people slipped away, choosing instead to stream the performance from the church. A critic from the New York Classical Review typed furiously, "While Wellington repeats flawless but hollow interpretations, his forgotten pupil has just reshaped contemporary music." On the Symphony Hall stage, Wellington's concentration unraveled, his memories clawed back, the brilliant student who had sacrificed Juilliard for service, the harsh words he had once thrown at him, "You're wasting your gift." Then the news of his student wounded overseas, news Wellington had ignored. For decades, Tommy Miller had been erased from his memory, until now. And in the church, Thomas reached the final section, a sweeping musical narration of his entire journey. From youthful promise, to loss in a distant war, to decades of silence and finally a rebirth, Thomas Miller's music carried it all. At that moment, the sound was no longer just performance. It was testimony. When the final note dissolved into stillness, the church froze. Then, as if awakened all at once, the audience erupted. A thunderous ovation shook the ancient walls. voices crying bravo in a chorus of gratitude and awe. Across town in Symphony Hall, Richard Wellington faced rows of empty seats. Barely a third of his audience remained. His phone buzzed relentlessly with alerts. Distracted, he missed a note, then another. His once flawless composure faltered. A new message flashed across his screen from the festival board. Immediate clarification required regarding Thomas Miller. Back in the church, Thomas raised his voice gently as the applause subsided. "I did not come here for revenge or humiliation. I came to share what I learned when the lights went out for me. True music doesn't need to be seen, it needs to be felt." Sarah hurried up to him, her eyes shining. "Thomas, social media is exploding. Producers, labels, they're all asking for you. What should I tell them?" Thomas smiled, serene. "Tell them that today, I'm not playing for contracts or fame. I'm playing for Clara, the woman who taught me how to see again. And yes, I'm playing for Richard Wellington too, to show him there is beauty beyond perfection. The true victory wasn't in crushing his former teacher, but in transforming grief into grace. The perfect revenge was not bitterness, but beauty." As Thomas stepped down from the stage, he left behind more than music. He left a question hanging heavy in every heart. How many voices remain unheard simply because the world chooses who deserves to be seen? The next morning, the answer echoed everywhere. The video of his performance passed 2 million views in less than 12 hours. Critics from the New York Times and The Guardian hailed it as a revelation, a redefinition of virtuosity, and a testament to resilience translated into sound. Wellington, however, faced his reckoning. The festival board convened an emergency meeting. In an unprecedented move, they suspended him for 3 seasons. His record label announced a review of their partnership. Universities quietly withdrew invitations for his master classes. Sarah showed Thomas the headlines on her tablet. "They're calling you the forgotten conscience of classical music." Thomas's hand rested gently on the old wooden box. His smile was calm. "I never wanted Wellington destroyed. I only wanted him to listen, truly listen." The phone would not stop ringing. Deutsche Grammophon offered an exclusive recording contract. Lincoln Center extended an invitation for a recital series. In a symbolic gesture, Juilliard itself announced the creation of the Thomas Miller Scholarship, a program for veterans pursuing music. Meanwhile, in his luxury apartment, Wellington sat alone, watching Thomas's CNN interview for the 3rd time. On the screen, the veteran spoke without anger. "When I lost my sight, I gained a new way of listening, not just with my ears, but with my whole body, with memory, with pain transformed into sound." Wellington switched off the television and walked to his Steinway. His hands hovered over the keys. He pressed down. But for the first time in 40 years, the piano gave him nothing. The keys lay silent beneath his technically flawless fingers. 3 months later, Thomas Miller opened a small adaptive music school in Nashville. With the support of contracts and new sponsorships, he created a space where those often overlooked could find their voices through music. Veterans coping with trauma, children who could not see, all were welcome. Clara would have approved. Sarah, now his assistant and director of the foundation, managed the growing program. Dozens of students filled the classrooms each week. One crisp autumn afternoon, she entered his office with a folded letter. "I have something for you," she said softly. Thomas turned toward the cool breeze drifting through the open window. "What is it?" "A letter," Sarah replied, "from Richard Wellington." Thomas's expression remained calm. "Read it to me." The words, written in neat handwriting, were simple. "Thomas, for decades I taught technique, but you reminded me of what I had forgotten, the soul of music. I am learning how to listen again. If you will allow me, I would like to visit your school, not to teach, but to learn." "Wellington." Thomas smiled faintly, remembering the ambitious young teacher he had once known. "Tell him he'll be welcome. Music is generous. It always gives second chances." 2 weeks later, Wellington arrived. Gone was the polished arrogance. His designer suits had been replaced by modest clothes, his proud posture by a quiet humility. In the school's small concert hall, he watched as Thomas guided a group of children. The lesson was not about flawless scales or finger positions. It was about listening with the heart, finding beauty in imperfections, turning limitations into expression. That evening, Thomas sat at the piano once more. Wellington watched from the front row as the music unfolded, notes of loss, of war, of darkness, but also of renewal, forgiveness, and light. When the final chord faded, Wellington approached, tears gathering in his eyes. "You could have destroyed me completely." Thomas shook his head gently. "Revenge would have blinded me twice. I chose to turn pain into something better." Thomas Miller's greatest triumph was never in humiliating his teacher or winning late recognition. It was in reshaping what vision meant in music. Where one man had chased perfection, the other revealed truth. Truth forged in shadow, revealed in sound. Teacher and student, divided by war but reunited by music, became living proof that true virtuosity has nothing to do with what the eyes can see, and everything to do with what the soul can feel. And if this story touched your heart, remember, greatness often comes from the most unlikely places. The best revenge isn't to destroy those who doubted you. It's to rise so high, to create something so beautiful that even your harshest critics have no choice but to stand in silence before the undeniable truth of your talent.